the product isn't as important as the process in compensation. The process is the most important part because you have to get everybody from one island to the next island. Or the other way people talk about it is everybody's at the station. Did you get them on the train or didn't you? Right?
Yeah,
They're on the platform. Did you get them on the train?
It's a great piece of wisdom.
Yeah. That's the important part.
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Joining me today is physician compensation expert Steve Franey, whose career spans more than 40 years in healthcare consulting. Steve has worked with more than 20 medical groups on a redesign of their physician compensation system. His practice over the years has focused on strategic planning, mergers and acquisitions, governance, and organizational development. He enjoys working with groups to see how their compensation systems can positively impact their challenges and help them to achieve their vision. Steve, welcome. Thanks for being with me today.
Thanks so much, Jill.
It's great to see you. It's great to have you here, and I'm so excited to share with our whole audience all of your expertise around compensation. So I should also mention Steve is guest faculty in our Physician Leadership Project, where he covers governance and compensation, two small topics. And Steve, I think we very generously give you about an hour for each, right? So that's good of us. So I'm ever so glad you agreed to come here and talk a little bit about compensation today. I know our audience will be very interested to hear about what can be kind of a charged topic. So a good place to start would be to hear from you with your years of experience at a very basic level. What is compensation?
Well, at a basic level, at the beginning, it's a means of payment, and that's pretty simple. But its power is that it can be used as a tool to address the challenges that confront a medical group. Mm-hmm. And often what happens is medical groups get enamored and, if you will, used to the compensation system that they have. And even though the environment is changing all around them, they keep the same compensation model, not realizing how powerful it can be in terms of changing behaviors in the direction that they need to go as a group. And so when you think about a compensation system, you want to think about it being grounded in your culture and in your values. And that's another thing that sometimes groups lose track of. They would often call me and you, Jill, and say, why are we still together? We're having trouble figuring that out.
Yeah.
And sometimes compensation is the vehicle that can be used actually to pull things back together. Mm-hmm. Because as you start a change in compensation, you are going back to the fundamentals of why do we exist? What is it that we share in common? What are the objectives that we're trying to achieve together as a group?
It's a great point. It can be used as a very strategic tool. And I think a lot of groups probably don't think about it that way. It tends to be thought about more as just a basis for how people get paid, rather than something that you can utilize, really, as you said, to help the group grow and morph in the direction that they need to.
Right. I think, the other thing I would say, Jill, is that um, there are a lot of challenges in compensation, and there are always going to be winners and losers, and there are always people that are going to want to protect their turf. And so um, it was dangerous for practice administrators to get involved in compensation historically, because that would probably mean that you might be putting your position on the line. And the reason for that is just simply that um, that there are people, there are individuals in a practice who are going to be married to the status quo, and individuals in a practice who are for change. And when those two collide, everyone is impacted. And so this issue of being ready for uh, for compensation and the discussion around compensation is no small matter. Readiness is truly very important, and sometimes it takes a burning platform, something that um, can't can't be solved. And so, an example of a burning platform might be a group who finds itself unable to attract interns into their practice, and they're competing against um, hospital-based groups and other private practices, and they're confronting um, issues around um, older shareholders in the group getting ready to retire, and um, probably have waited too long in some cases to really address the issue. But um, fundamentally, they've got to think about ways that they can make their compensation system attractive to a generation of physicians who may not have the same set of drivers in terms of their careers, in terms of their risk profiles, in terms of what's important to them with regard to balancing work life and personal life.
That's a critical piece as we go into groups, is looking at their orientation toward the newer generation of doctors coming in, and what worked 10 or 15 or 20 years ago is very different from what's likely to work today and what's likely to attract new physicians today. Very different breed, different generation, and requires new systems. And that brings us to one of your favorite points that you like to make about what compensation is. I remember you like to tell a little joke.
If you don't know where you're going, anywhere's a good direction.
That's right. And it is riddled with landmines when you start a conversation about compensation. And I appreciate your point about it being a bit of a dangerous proposition for some administrators, and that
Right.
probably it's because it could be very politically charged and emotionally charged, and that's probably the reason why a lot of compensation plans stay the same year over year over year. And as we go into practices to begin looking at them, they haven't been touched in many, many years. And
Right.
that's, yeah.
And so, one of the things that you want to do is you prepare to enter into a discussion about either designing or redesigning your existing compensation system. So starting from scratch all over again, or tweaking what it is that you already have. You need to understand where are the challenges that you face, both internally and externally, with regard to your practice. And you need to be really clear about what you want the end product to look like, because you won't know if you got it right if you don't identify the goals that you're trying to achieve beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Because I will tell you for certain, Jill, as soon as you start producing numbers, everybody starts with, how's it going to impact me? And you hope it doesn't stay there very long and they can take the bigger picture of what's best for the group.
And that, I believe, takes a different amount of time for different individuals. And,
It does. It does. And but I would say that if you structure it correctly, if the group was ready to take on the conversation and address the elephants that were in the room,
mm-hmm.
it in many ways speak truth
Yes.
about the current situation, then you have a really high probability of getting there. And I think I think the thing to recognize is that compensation fundamentally is going to create winners and losers
mm-hmm.
as part of the outcome of the redesign. And both winning and losing are not they're all about perspective. So I may have lost some compensation, but I'm going to be in the short term, but I'm going to be better off in the long term, right? Mm-hmm. And so this perspective is really important. And there are a lot of forks in the road when you're talking about the various decisions that have to get made along the way. And what you're using as the levers to change the behavior, sort of the, if you will, the components of the engine of the compensation model. And the nice thing about compensation, from my perspective, is that if you design the structure correctly, you can add on rooms as you go along. If you design it poorly, it will become Band-Aids, and those Band-Aids will not hold. Yeah. And I will tell you that when you enter into those initial discussions and the remaining members of the group can't tell you 20 years, 30 years later how they got to their current model, mm-hmm. and they can no longer calculate it themselves. They need accountants and lawyers and other people to figure it out for them. Then really, at one level, we've lost our way, because compensation should be something that each of us is able to calculate for ourselves, that we know, we intrinsically know what the value of our work is, mm-hmm. and we know how our compensation model rewards us for the things that we do. It could penalize us for the things that it does not want to encourage, mm-hmm. Along mm-hmm. the way. But again, it's a matter of perspective. I think when you think about the implementation of a compensation model, what you should think about is the idea that you've got either an existing model or a redesigned model, and if you're going to be making iterative changes to that model over mm-hmm. time, what you want to do is shadow those iterative changes. So you want to compensate based on the old, but you want to always be showing everyone what the new model is going to be doing, because that gives everyone the chance actually to begin to move towards the mean of the direction that the group is trying to go.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And that's a great segue into our question about how compensation can be used as a strategic tool for groups.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about that, as a strategic tool, compensation begins to be the mechanism for change. And strategically, what that means is that we can modify practices and and get to the place that we need to be. So I'm going to use an example. So I work with a large FQHC, and they one of the clinics had a number of primary care providers, family practitioners, who were doing lots of procedural work because the old compensation model provided them incentive to do that procedural work.
Okay.
But the problem is when they ran over to their surgery center or to the hospital to do their procedure work, they left all of their colleagues in the clinic trying to handle all of the patients that were walking through the door that couldn't be turned away. And so what they decided as part of their compensation model was to raise the value of in-person primary care visits and lower the value of procedural work. And they could do that internally, irrespective of how they were being paid externally, and accomplish what they wanted to. And we watched the proceduralist slow all of that down and spend more time seeing patients, which is what their obligation was and what they needed to be able to do. So that's an example of really a strategic issue, because for FQHCs, it's all based upon, if you will, the number of clicks, the number of visits and encounters that you actually are providing.
And that's an important point that you raise as well, that the systems can be used in response to what's happening in the external environment. So that's a good reason to have good business people, as you say, good accountants and attorneys who can give you advice. And I wanted to underscore what you said a couple of moments ago, that it's really important for physicians to understand and be able to calculate their own compensation. And that if their system, as you and I have seen many over the years that have morphed and evolved over so many years, and there's so many add-ons and tweaks, and that a physician in the group cannot actually calculate their own compensation, without a lot of inputs. That's a good indicator that it's time to redesign and simplify. Yeah.
Right.
The first group that I worked with in healthcare about 30 years ago had a procedure. I kid you not, this was back in the 3-ring binder days, but it was 30 pages of written procedure, how to close out the month from an accounting perspective, and about 10 or 15 pages were instructions on how to calculate the physician compensation. And it had just evolved over time and had never been revisited or simplified, and you could see where each iteration made sense to somebody at some point in time, but all of the adjustments made it impossible for anyone other than the holder of the 3-ring binder to really be able to reproduce all 30 steps, all 30 pages.
Yeah. The other big strategic thing from my perspective that can be facilitated by compensation is this notion of embedding of the culture and values of the group by embedding certain practices in the compensation model. So that can be done literally in a variety of ways. An example might be if you're trying to improve the quality of the care that you provide, then somewhere along the way, maybe not in the beginning, but as one of those add-ons that you do over time, you may want to have a portion of the compensation directly related to quality measures. And those can be insurance, partner-based measures, or they can be internal measures of quality and performance. Again, I recommend you shadow them before and test them.
Yes.
Before you put them in practice. But there's so many things that you can do with regard to that solidify those norms and behaviors that you're looking for.
It's fantastic to get everything in alignment. That's when you really can start to see things. How about, I know you have when you talk about compensation with groups, I know that you have a set of universal truths about what your compensation plan needs to be. And I'd love to hear those from you.
So I have a set of 6 universal truths that I think are really important for compensation. The first is one, Jill, that you've touched on and that I've touched on, and that is simplicity. The simpler, the better. Easy to understand what the levers are and how the levers work. So as an example, when you use work RVUs as a lever versus using collections as a lever, what you get is you reach an understanding that one of the values of work RVUs is that it doesn't penalize payer mix.
Correct. Yeah.
And if your group is interested in serving its community, and some members of the group, either historically or by preference, have a larger portion of poorer paid patients,
yes,
then the value that you're trying to achieve is being a resource for the community, being the community's primary care hub. And so it shouldn't matter to you, and your compensation can reflect that, what the payer mix is. Yes. As long as the ultimate result of your compensation model is that it's sustainable, right? It shouldn't matter what the payer mix is. And so work RVUs have this singularly great benefit. They have other benefits as well, but it's understanding each of these levers and what they can do and what they can't do, what they solve for, and what maybe some unintended side effects actually are of the levers. So that's one. We talked a little bit about this notion of transparency, that everybody should be able to calculate their own compensation. It shouldn't take the accountants weeks to figure out what the compensation was.
Yes, I've heard the old saw that if the physicians can explain the compensation system while standing on one foot, then you have the right level of simplicity and transparency. Yeah.
Right. But it comes down to, how are you going to attract new providers into your group if you don't understand your own compensation system and you can't explain it to them, and you haven't figured out what it is they need and what it is you need, in terms of what essentially is a transactional relationship until they become a shareholder or a partner in your group, right? And um, and you have to understand the relationship between signing bonuses and guarantees and incentives in a compensation structure for either experienced new physicians who are coming into your group versus newly minted physicians coming out of fellowship training or their residency. And so these are all things to, pay attention to. But it's really important that you understand and can explain your compensation system, and for new providers that you can give them a real clear idea of what the first couple of years are going to look like for them.
That's key for recruiting, and
Totally.
generally not always the first question that a
Mm-hmm.
potential physician will ask, but definitely an important one in part of the recruitment process, and definitely one to have some clarity around, and a question to be able to answer clearly and concisely and
Mm-hmm.
transparently. So,
Right.
yes, yeah.
So the third truth is around viability and sustainability. Those often don't come into play when um, when you are designing a system, except really at the end, to make sure that it's all going to work and that the dollars are going to be there. One thing that I've found over time is, with the propensity of everyone wanting to look at every iteration of a change in the compensation model from their individual perspective,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that you can do to help people grab on to um, the strategic nature of a model is don't do a comparison to what they are paid now. Simply present the model and what the impact is by provider
Mm-hmm.
without doing the comparison. And then they have to look at it straight on. They have to say, well, okay, so do we really feel like, if we want to um, take a look at RAF scores and actually incentivize RAF scores, um, what percentage of our compensation do we really want to give that? And how confident are we that we can move the group from maybe um, where there's a lot of room for improvement to um, a higher level of performance, knowing from a sustainability perspective that that's going to generate more income, that we're going to work smarter, not harder, when we've got this system in place.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just, something to think about.
Yeah, the viability piece, and tracing back several years when most groups were eat what you kill or eat what you treat.
Mm-hmm.
There's viability there, right? You're splitting up the pie at the end of the day, and so adding some of these more sophisticated measures and levers, as you're calling them, to move the group, is, I think, it's great design for the plan. Again, as long as the physicians can describe, why I'm getting paid on work RVUs, or why I'm getting paid on, in part based on our RAF scores. And yeah, it absolutely has to sit on a platform of financial viability. Otherwise, you've kind of got a pie in the sky model that's never going to work if there's not the
Right.
money to fund it. So, yeah.
And so the fifth universal truth is based on values and culture, and we've talked a little bit about that. Um, my example would be, um, do you pay for call or don't you pay for call in a group?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if you're an OB group, that might be a big deal.
Yeah.
Maybe if um, you're a nephrology group, maybe it isn't. And so how you incentivize and what you incentivize um, isn't um, isn't one size fits all. I think that the best compensation system is designed from the ground up based on the challenges that confront the group and where the group is trying to go.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says, well, let me just pull something off the shelf and give that to you, it's not likely to be as effective as it could be, or you would want it to be. And so those are things to think about as you go forward. And again, we've talked about compensation as a tool for changing behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't, though, be used as a disciplinary tool. If you've got discipline problems, those aren't compensation issues, and you need to be able to deal with them really on the governance side of your organization and how you manage your group. Changing a compensation system to deal with someone that is not behaving well is the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on.
Got
and
it.
if you can add a lot of Band-Aids, and you're going to find yourself not where you want to be.
And you could find those fancy Band-Aids that have superheroes on them or camouflage, still a Band-Aid, right?
Yes.
That's fantastic. So universal truth number 6, compensation not to be used to manage
Not to be used to manage people.
the people problems. Yeah, definitely.
People
Yeah.
problems.
Oh,
Doesn't
that's
work.
wonderful. Well, how about a little bit? Now we've got everybody primed for this discussion. So now our listeners are saying, okay, I think I could take this on. What would you suggest for them as beginning steps or sort of initial steps to lay the foundation?
I would say that the beginning steps would be to create a compensation committee, and for the management committee or the board of directors to identify a group of individuals who have the capacity to think and act beyond their own self-interests as foundational members of a compensation committee. And once you chartered that committee from the board or management committee perspective, and you've told them what it is that you want them to do for you and in what time frame you want them to do it, and who the leader of that compensation committee needs to be, because that's really important along the way. Then you have set them in motion. And what they then need to do is their very first task is to identify the goals that they are trying to achieve with a new or redesigned compensation model. And because those goals, as I've said before, are the way that you know whether you've been successful or you've not.
Fantastic. And I imagine some of our listeners would feel like being invited to be on the compensation committee might be a great reward, and some would feel like it might be a great punishment.
Yes.
Yeah. Service on the compensation committee. Yeah.
It could be it could be looked at from both perspectives. It's when you think about that, this is going to be a change, no matter what it is that you're doing. Thinking about those members of the committee who might be opinion leaders in your group, thinking about members that have some financial acumen and are comfortable with numbers is also important. But you want people also who are grounded in the culture of the organization, who will speak the truth about what it is that we need to do as a group to maintain that uniqueness that is us.
Yes. Who can advocate for that and kind of keep that as the North Star as the group is.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. That North Star part is really important.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about in your compensation committee is, do you have people on the committee that are willing to step forward and be the communicators of the committee's work?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the end, if you don't have all of the committee members aligned with the recommendations, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so you not only need the committee to be aligned, but you need the committee to be able to communicate with their partners.
Yes. Yes.
With regard to what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to be able to really address head on those members who may, from their perspective, see this as a loss for them,
Mm-hmm.
and be able to help them understand why this is in the best interest of the group overall.
And getting the bigger perspective and the longer
Yes.
term perspective. And you alluded to something a couple moments ago, but I like to think about it within the group. Who are the formal and, probably more importantly, who are the informal power brokers in the group?
Mm.
We don't frequently think about colleagues that way, but whose opinion people value when someone speaks at a board meeting and the group listens. Those are great people to add or invite to your compensation committee.
And I'm doing a compensation plan for a group right now where one of the members of the compensation committee is someone who has retired in the middle of our work.
Yep.
And everyone values, even though he no longer is a member of, is a shareholder, they value what he has to say about
Absolutely.
compensation. He's the historian. He's the
Yeah.
one that has been around and seen all of the changes over time, doesn't necessarily know why they all occurred in the way that they did, but has a good idea of the history, and in some ways, in his current role, can be incredibly objective.
Absolutely. Well, he doesn't have a horse in the race.
He doesn't have a horse in the race.
So
Yeah.
he could be extremely objective. That's fantastic, and that's a great suggestion to see. Even if groups embark on this journey and there perhaps there's a recently retired person,
Mm-hmm.
one of the partners who could come back, and that definitely adds a lot of perspective. I always love to see groups who invite participation from soon-to-be shareholders. The younger
Mm-hmm.
physicians who aren't yet, they're perhaps on the shareholder track or the partner track, depending on their structure, but haven't yet made it there, but really are the future of the practice, and getting their voice, getting it and having them be heard and getting their voice at the table. It's
Right.
spans all the generations.
Yeah. I think the other thing, and this goes to you've seen one and you've seen one, is that if you're a multi-specialty group, you can still have an umbrella compensation structure and deal with the individual specialties in ways that are consistent in the marketplace in the way that they're best compensated.
Mm-hmm.
So, to give you an example of that, you may pay a certain group of disciplines using work RVUs, and another group of disciplines within this multi-specialty group based on collections.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, someone might say, well, haven't you created chaos? And as long as the goals and the embedded values and all of those directional pieces are all in alignment, it can still stand. And I think of the many years ago when there were a number of different specialties in the group, and they wanted to bring in non-physician members of their practice.
Mm-hmm.
They were leaders in the community that I was working in, but they recognized that the contributions of their um, advanced practice providers were not the same contributions from a revenue perspective of the physicians themselves, that created a model that against a value of one,
Mm-hmm.
that provided a, multiplication factor into the compensation model that was sort of on the outside of the compensation model, but ultimately impacted sort of the compensation. Because you have to think about sometimes creating pools of compensation
Mm-hmm.
within a compensation structure. And, you and I have talked about many of the various types of structures that are created. Again, um, when I think of what's going on in a heavily managed care market, a lot of the old nuts and bolts don't come together very well. And especially if you're moving to value-based reimbursement.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to think about compensation models that are aligning with the incentives of the payer around quality.
Yes. Yes. Well, and the conversation around APPs and how to fold them into the
Right.
plans, both from the perspective of the APP can frequently make the physician's schedule, I like to say, higher octane. If
Yes.
they're caring for a certain portion of the patients at a certain level, and the physician therefore has higher degree of complexity and therefore better coding and higher visit value, if you will, is one way they can positively impact. And then on the quality piece, as we're heading toward value-based reimbursement, the APPs have a very special and critical role there in the practices too. So I love the thought about how do you fold that in, and again back to what are the cultural underpinnings and what are the behaviors that you want to reward with the
Right.
compensation. So I feel like we could talk about this all day, and I want to make sure we are about to wrap up, but I'd love to hear from you a bit about kind of key readiness and process for
Mm-hmm.
groups, and then maybe a few quick examples of different structures for compensation systems for our listeners.
Mm-hmm. Um, and I guess before I do that, Jill, I wanted to say that um, there's no a fixed amount of time that it takes to do compensation in a group.
Good point.
Um, you can get a group that is ready to discuss it, but how long that process takes, um, you really need to be able to um, uh, both work with the committee and evolve them in the process, and then have a separate process on the outside in which communication is periodically going out to their peers.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would say on average, a compensation plan takes 6 to 9 months to
Okay.
do, because you need that amount of time um, to process. So um, the the product isn't as important as the process in compensation. The process is the most important part because you have to get everybody from one island to the next island. Or the other way people talk about it is everybody's at the station. Did you get them on the train or didn't you? Right?
Yeah.
They're on the
Yeah.
platform. Did you get them on the train?
It's a great
And
piece of wisdom. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the important part. So that's a little bit about the timing part of it. In terms of preparation, we've talked about readiness, but we haven't talked about data. Data is really important. There are external sources of data, and maybe those are valid, and maybe those aren't valid inside a particular group. And so you have to know when you can use them. Sometimes you just provide them as a mirror, and sometimes they're just there, and the compensation committee says, well, I understand what that all says, but this is what the benchmarks we're going to use, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay as long as the whole product works out. So data is really important. Understanding how people are paid. You literally, if you are entering a compensation process where no one can explain the old model, you have to be able, as the consultant and committee, to actually be able to explain what you're currently doing, so that you understand not only its complexity, but what it is that you need to fundamentally change. You have to know where all the levers are and how the levers work. And then you can move and think about the new model. And so oftentimes we're looking at compensation histories that go back as many as 3 years. And COVID really threw us for a loop, because things weren't the same in COVID at all in terms of revenue, productivity, and PPE changed, actually caused a lot of groups trouble because they couldn't see what was really going on in their practice, right? Yeah. And so compensation was impacted, maybe positively, but maybe negatively in the long run. And so, all of this comes into play. But when we talk about models, we've talked a little bit about guarantees and guaranteed base. There's revenue less expense kinds of models. There's base and productivity models. There are base productivity and quality models. There are base and performance incentive models. Those are structurally the kind of groups of things, but as I like to think about it, it's your bucket of Tinker Toys or Legos, and you dump them out on the table, and you have these various pieces that you can put together and align. And how you do that is really, at one level, the art of compensation. At another level, it's the process of change.
Yes. Yeah.
So what I like to say is it's okay to develop a series of straw men. Straw men are models or ways of thinking about things that you don't have any investment in, but they help the committee think differently about something, right? Yeah. And you want them to be irritated by the straw man. You want them to find fault with the straw man, because in doing so, what they're doing is they're telling you about what they value.
Yes.
Right.
And you can iterate from there.
And you can iterate from there. So it can take months and months to get to a final decision, but once you are there, you've got everyone there.
Yes.
Because they went through all of it with you and together. And that's the value of the committee.
That's fantastic. Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. I have enjoyed the conversation, and I know that this will be really helpful for our audience as well, physicians and administrators alike. And we will add your contact information into our show notes so that if listeners would like to be in touch or send you their sticky compensation questions, they can do so. And again, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jill.
You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can subscribe to the Medical Money Matters content website for physician leaders to find budget templates and many other tools. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you and send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.